If you're a writer, you've probably heard of the idea of the hero's journey. A hero departs from home, goes to fight distant evil, and to collect a reward and to come home. It was an essentially revolutionary concept proposed by Joseph Campbell. What's interesting about the hero's journey is that it has a lot of masculine features. The warrior story, the soldier story. And so today, with author Douglas Burton, we're going to be talking about his book, The Heroine's Labyrinth. We're going to be diving into the idea of the female story archetype that is much more suited to the basic conflicts and issues that women typically face. Okay, let's dig into talking about The Heroine's Labyrinth with Douglas. So good to meet you, Douglas. I'm really excited to talk about your book because usually when I read writing craft books, I don't get to, chat with the author about them. So I'm really
Oh,
excited.
to be perfectly honest, it's very fun to talk about. It's fun to talk about patterns and stories regardless. I remember, the hero's journey and going through that and kind of feeling excited about it. But then also, the hero's journey can be a little limiting. So this is just a new lens to look through stories with.
Absolutely. So, Douglas, you're the author of the historical fiction novel Faraway Bird,
Yes, yes, I
um,
am.
and as well as The Heroine's Labyrinth. So, where can we find your books and how can we support you as an author?
The Faraway Bird as the Heroine's Labyrinth are both available on Amazon.com, or really anywhere books are sold. And Faraway Bird, I was able to produce an audiobook as well. And I always recommend the audiobook. I'm kind of an audiobook guy. And
Me too.
yeah, and I had a friend who actually created some original music for that. So it's the audiobook version came out very, very, like I'm very proud of it. Um,
Awesome.
so, and then, obviously the same is true with the Heroine's Labyrinth that is also available on Audible. I'm sorry, on Amazon. It is not available on Audible yet because I have not created the audiobook, but you can get that anywhere you want. And it's a beautiful book. It's got, tarot cards in there. Like
It
it
is.
it came out nice. I was very happy with it.
It's gorgeous, and especially the cover. It's just so cool looking. So, something that we both have in common is that we love writing craft and story structure, I think. Um,
Yes.
it sounds like this book came from your deep love of that and deep dive into it and almost finding a lack, a space where there needed to be something and there wasn't. So, can you talk to us about how you came up with this concept and what this concept is of the feminine monomyth?
Right. Thank you for summarizing that. That was very good. I did not plan to write this book. This wasn't something that I was like, you know what? I'm going to tackle this. I want to figure out if there's a female monomyth. Like that wasn't on my mind. That wasn't on my radar. In fact, quite the opposite. I was pretty happy with the hero's journey. I had studied it for 20 years and like literally way back in the day, I'd sit on the sofa and hit pause and take notes, and everything. So I would watch movies all the way back to VHS, and taking notes on these things. So I really believed in the hero's journey, and I'm not against it. I haven't like turned against the hero's journey. However, I did run into some massive limitations when I was writing my historical fiction novel. I bet the farm on the hero's journey. I thought I could take her life, which has real biographical details, and fit it into the hero's journey. And I have heard some people say, what are you nuts? There's no way that that would work. Why would you even think that? And the fact is, the hero's journey isn't some fake model that somebody made up. It is a like a shadow that's cast into our stories from real life. There's real life examples, and I remember experiencing certain parts of the hero's journey, even myself in my life, where it became almost therapeutic or helpful to me to extract some of the wisdom of that arc and understand that my story isn't over, that there's ways to bounce back. So the idea of using the hero's journey to structure a novel, not to write women or to write a certain character, but to structure a novel, it seemed to be a home run idea. And when I was writing Faraway Bird, I realized about a third of the way in that the narrative model was not fitting to her biographical details at all. And that was kind of devastating because I believed in the hero's journey so much. So what I started to do was I started to look for a feminine equivalent. I was like, the hero's journey is kind of has some male centrism to it. There's kind of a hunter warrior ethos to it. Maybe there's a feminine equivalent. And there are books out there, and they're good books Gail Carriger wrote a book called The Heroine's Journey. More famously, Maureen Murdoch wrote a book called The Heroine's Journey. The Women Who Run with Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Meander Spiral Explode by Jane Allison. I mean, there's just a number of books, but none of them seem to be uniquely suited to writing, and I couldn't use them as readily as I could for the hero's journey. So I wanted something that was concise and easy to understand, easy to identify, and specifically suited for writers. And this it was crazy because I didn't even know what I was starting. I was like, I'm just going to start watching some movies with heroines. I'm going to go back and read all the old literature. Like I went back and I read Pride and Prejudice. I read Jane Eyre, Memoirs of a Geisha, which is actually one of my favorites. It's a great book. And read some of these classic stories and watched some of these movies. And I started to notice different patterns. And it was apparent to me that these patterns were absolutely not part of the hero's journey. And the first time I had an idea that there might be not a variation of the hero's journey, because that's easy to think of too. Maybe it's just a modification of it. Was I was listening to The Great Courses by Professor Hannah B. Harvey, and she was getting into an analysis of Little Red Riding Hood. And she was talking about how Little Red Riding Hood has many variations over the years, and how it's actually a story about budding womanhood, hence the red hood, and how it's about a character who confronts a masculine beast in disguise in the home setting, and she even goes on to talk about how there's some more direct correlations between that phase of a woman's life. And I thought to myself, I was like, that none of that's in the hero's journey, like at all. Like the hero's
Yeah.
journey blows right through that. That's not even a consideration. So that's when I started to think that maybe there's something completely standalone that could be identified and usable. And the notes that I took at that time became this book, which even at the time I didn't count on writing. I thought they were just notes, but I was encouraged to write it as a book, and I'm glad that I did. It took 4 years, but I'm glad I did it.
I think the book is amazing. Like how I think about writing craft is that I have like a framework in my head, and when things really ring true and I see it over and over and over, even if it's a new theory to me, I can recognize it everywhere. I lock that into the framework, right? Everything else that doesn't quite ring true kind of falls away, you know?
Right.
And there are things like that I read and I'm like, well, it doesn't fit with me. And maybe it's true, maybe it helps someone. But this book has already settled into the framework. It's there. And
Uh,
so it really rings true for me.
that is
Um,
beautiful. I love hearing that. And I do want to say a couple things on that, just so it's not misunderstood. I don't think this is exclusive to women. I think it is gender non-exclusivist. There are plenty of male stories with male leads that follow the heroine's labyrinth. It's not a one size fits all, and it's not a book on how to write women. I would be the last. That's crazy to think that I would write that. But some people have misunderstood what I'm attempting to do, and I think they have maybe misunderstood me and my intentions with this. My goal is to help writers. If it's useful, use it, and if it's not, then look elsewhere. And I think that that's totally okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's incredibly helpful if you take it for what it is, which is a theory, and a really, really helpful framework. The thing that I was really stunned by was that I'm writing a book and have been writing it and editing it for a while, and it is a complete heroine's labyrinth. And
Love
so
it.
I calculated up. I've been calling them archetypal elements. What do you call them? Like each of the individual like 18 aspects.
So I've been calling them archetypal designs
Okay.
because it's more than just an archetype. Like an archetype is I think a single impression, whereas an archetypal design actually comes with a structure to it in and of itself. And or an archetypal event. I've called it an
Okay.
archetypal event as well. But there is a pattern there, and it's important to unpack the pattern, and that's why I have that anatomy of an archetype, because there are usually multiple aspects to the archetype at work simultaneously, and that's what makes it recognizable. So, and you're saying you saw this in your own writing.
Yeah, mine has 16 out of 18. I think the poison apple and I think the fragile power, the only two I don't have. And so it mapped on pretty much exactly. And some of the book came from like structurally from pieces of my own life. And so I was like also able to see my own life in the book, like you were saying for the hero's journey. So I really like it.
Makes me feel good. That's a mission accomplished. If it's something useful to you, then I've achieved the goal. That's all I really wanted is it for it to be useful for somebody, specifically a writer.
Right. And it's honestly a bit shocking to me that this idea hasn't really been built before, because we've had the hero's journey for so long and we know that it's about the male hero, right, in a lot of ways. And obviously, there have been a ton of female heroes who have had
Sure.
their story modeled after this, and that's great. And there are women who that is their story. But it's not as common for that to be the woman's story, the warrior story. And so I'm like, it's just kind of blowing my mind. It's like, why, like why haven't we thought of this before? But the fact that you did is really cool.
Oh, awesome. That's great. And what's interesting is I actually think the hero's journey might be far more rare than we thought. I have found more of a labyrinth structure in more stories than I cared. I'm like, am I crazy to think I'm seeing this over and over again? But it's at work, and like I said, that's why I made the anatomy of an archetype so that it's not just me. Here's the preset. You tell me if you see that at work in the story. So one of the goals was to make it recognizable and definable, and I see a lot of stories that follow the labyrinth structure, and there's wisdom to it. Like I learned a lot by extracting this. Heroines are modeling, solutions to the, problems in society, personal problem. Like they're modeling ways out, and there's a lot there for people to learn, even if you're not using it to write. There's
Yeah.
lessons there.
Yeah, I mean, if the point is to write a story that resonates with readers, right? Not with just writers who are going to say, "Oh, I
Right.
can use that." Right? So then it's you're trying to create something that's going to resonate with every person who reads it in some way. Yeah, and I think hopefully it'll do that. I've seen that. Is there a perfect story example that you use that you bring up that you say this is the heroine's labyrinth? This story has every element, or
So
something as
I
close to.
Right. So I'm about to launch a YouTube channel, and
Cool.
I have started to edit some videos because it's one thing to talk about it, but it's nice to put out a video that you can really lay it out. So, and that's where I'm starting. The two examples that I give usually that have, I think, every beat um, is Silence of the Lambs and Coraline. Those are two perfect examples, I would say. For the most part, there's always slight adjustments. I think the key is that you're not pulling a muscle to try to fit an archetype into a
Yep.
story. Because I had that problem with the hero's journey. I'm like, maybe this is the wise mentor, and you're really stretching it, and you kind of know that it's not really. So that's another thing. I want people to feel free not to. If it's not there, it's not there. And you just said, like, I don't have a poisoned apple. I don't have a fragile power. Perfect. Not every story needs every beat. In fact, sometimes what makes a story interesting is the beats that you skip. So always strongly encourage people to go with their into. It's good to have a logical framework or a structure to operate off of, but I'm also very heavy on intuition. So I like when writers go with their gut and break from the pattern just as much as I like the idea of the pattern to pull from if it's useful.
Yeah, so that's something that I want to get into a little bit later with some examples. But so first, because I have context and you have context, but viewers might not. So let's go through the
Sure.
first few designs, at least lay the groundwork for what the labyrinth is, so that the viewers can kind of understand what we're talking about here. So
Okay,
maybe let's
that
start
that's a
with,
great
yeah,
point. We're talking about it, and people are like, what is
right.
it? So I would say the most important aspect of this is understanding something that I call the heroine's conflict triangle, and this is the first three, in essence, the first three archetypal designs. And if these are in place, you have a story. Like it will be there, and you're off and running. First is the labyrinth itself. And the labyrinth, for example, I was trying to figure out what did Ripley from Aliens have in common with Jane Eyre? right? Here's two heroines. They're completely different genres. What about their world do they share? And I realized, and so the labyrinth became a metaphor for socio-cultural conflicts, which is a system of rules, regulations, expectations, traditions, gender norms, anything you could think of that says you can do this, but you can't do that. If you do this, there's consequences. This idea of making cultural decisions. A lot of times, especially in the old like British literature stories, there's a sense of win or lose game-like scenarios for the heroine where play your cards right with these male suitors and you'll live happily ever after. And if you blow it, you're going to be socially outcast. They're going to put a scarlet letter on you. So, that's why I picked the labyrinth because it captures the sense of feeling penned in, and yet there's freedom of movement. There's dead ends, there's twists and turns, and there is a game-like feel to the culture game, right? So, and then of course in a lot of action films, the labyrinthine imagery, especially in film, it is baked right into the images on the screen. Like Ripley's navigating the air ducts at one point. Sarah Connor's trying to escape the mental institution where she's penned in. This imagery just keeps reappearing. So, defining the labyrinth is the first thing, the socioeconomic structure that is keeping the heroine in place. What is it? What are the rules that she can and can't do? That's the first one. The second one is the heroine herself, and this is one of the most important aspects. And this actually works with the hero's journey, but it's a little bit different. The sacred fire, and this helped me tremendously as a writer because you always hear about character motivations, right? What's your character's motivation? And you're like, they want this, and sometimes it's never satisfying enough of an answer. But when I was watching, have you ever seen the movie Quest for Fire?
No.
Okay, so it's an older movie. It's kind of a goofy movie, but it's these cavemen who have fire, and there's other cavemen that come up and try to steal it, and then the other ones are like running away and they're trying to keep this thing lit. It's crazy, right? In a weird way, that seems to
It makes
be
sense.
how heroines are experience certain things. There seems to be claims upon their sacred fire by outside forces and by themselves. So the sacred fire isn't just the character motivation for, let's say, a female protagonist in this case. It is what she wants, what she cares about, and that can manifest itself as a cause, as a behavioral pattern, like Clarice Starling wants to save victims. That is her sacred fire, and she's willing to do a lot to live up to that motivation. But it's or like for Princess Leia, it's the Rebel Alliance. That's her cause. That's her sacred fire. That's what she cares about. So understanding what the heroine cares about is very, very important. But not just in terms of character motivation. Also, the sacred fire breaks down into two components. One is a creative force. There's something about her sacred fire that is a positive impact on the world. It's a creative aspect. It could be writing music. It could be your ability as a professional. It could be a revolutionary cause. I think you were talking about Katniss Everdeen. So, but it has a positive effect on the world. And the other aspect is what I call the beautiful force. And this is interesting because there's something about the hero and sacred fire that attracts others to her. And it creates a range of bizarre behavior a lot of times. She's dealing with people who are drawn into her. So, and the native culture is one. The native culture claims the hero and sacred fire. Disney films are good examples of this dynamic, where the heroine has her opening number. Even Dorothy, somewhere over the rainbow, the heroine sings about what she wants. She's telling the world her aspirations. She feels penned in by the native culture, but because the native culture has plans for her already, they've already made a claim on her. Also important about the sacred fire, although it's very individualistic in terms of how the heroine feels and experiences her sacred fire, it doesn't come from nothing. It is passed to her from the culture itself. The example I always use is think of a giant bonfire and then imagine grabbing one of those logs and there's like a flame at the end of it. The culture, you come from a culture, you come from a family. So that is where this claim comes from the native culture. This is why the native culture feels so comfortable claiming the hero and sacred fire. You came from our culture. This is how we do things around here, and we expect you to conform to that. That's an immediate conflict, especially when the heroine's sacred fire doesn't conform to the wants of the native culture, which is common. And then the third component, the third archetypal design, the masked minotaur, which is the villain of these stories. The masked minotaur is a very specific type of villain. He's often duplicitous, and more importantly, he is homegrown. He's a member of the native culture, and this villain will try to claim the hero and sacred fire for themselves. And it's you'll see it everywhere. It's an almost pathological behavior out of the masked minotaur. They have a desire to I call it possessive love, which is very confusing to the heroine because one minute, like think of Cal Hotley from Titanic. One minute he's giving her the Hope Diamond. He's like, oh, I love you. Next minute he's hitting her. He's assaulting her and saying, you will learn to be my wife. That's a masked minotaur, a social apex character who has social power, but he hides a secret and tyrannical side. So once you have the heroine who understands and it feels her sacred fire and claims it, which is, agency, you have the native culture kicking in to say, nope, we have a claim on your sacred fire. And then you have the masked minotaur showing up and saying, I want that sacred fire. I don't even understand it, but I have to have it. And it's a possessive attitude, and that is your structural conflict dynamic in a lot of heroine centric stories. Some stories don't even have the masked minotaur. You can actually create a ton of conflict with just the heroine in her native culture.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to pause here and ask a couple
Okay,
questions. So yeah. So with the sacred fire, it can be so many things.
right,
And you had an example about Entangled. Her sacred fire is her hair, which is this magical power of healing and regeneration. And I was also wondering if like a character who has like a physical manifestation of a sacred fire is also reflecting something internal about that person. And so what I was trying to boil this all down to, because it can be so many things, but I think
right.
what makes it not too big of a category is that you can recognize it. And what I kept recognizing in the movies that I was watching while I was reading the book was it seems to be the thing that sets her apart from other people in the native culture.
Yes. Yes. So why her? Right?
Right.
There's to be, there's a lot of beautiful women out there. So why is this masked minotaur focused on her? There's something about her, and this because it's her story. So there's something about her that is drawing attention. There's something about her that she feels very strongly about. And so I think in terms of writing stories, and this is where the creativity of the author is so important, how you want to symbolize it is up to you. So like Entangled, you just mentioned Tangled. I thought it was brilliant that they decided to make her hair magical because it's not just long, right? It has this healing quality to it. So and Rapunzel's famous for her hair. So they took the famous thing about her and made that symbolically. Now, of course, they weren't thinking they did this intuitively, but it literally glows like a fire. It heals. The masked minotaur wants to possess that hair.
Yeah.
Because it makes her young. So it's a purely selfish reason that why the masked minotaur, Mother Gothel in this case, is trying to possess the heroine for that sacred fire. And the heroine, her desire is to go out into the world. And if you when I said there's a continuity factor with the native culture, her hair is part of her birthright. She recognizes she is, and what else do they do? What else in that movie do they use to symbolize the continuity between the princess's birthright and Rapunzel? They literally light little fires in the Lantern Festival and they set them up in the air. And that's what she sees that Mother Gothel lies to her about. Like, oh, you mean the stars. And,
Right.
she's always kind of like gaslighting her and trying to keep her disoriented. So, it is symbolic. And it's how the author wants to handle that symbolism. And I think it's good to take a second and try to come up with a symbol. What can encapsulate it? For Moana, it's that Pualu stone.
Hmm.
Even in male-oriented stories with Superman, 1978, it's that green crystal. It's a symbol of his native culture, and yet it's also a symbol of his individualism. A good symbol can really do a lot of heavy lifting in a story.
So something I'm noticing here as I read through the whole book, it seems to be really describing, as the hero's journey does, a character growth arc.
Yes.
And so that's kind of how I'm analyzing it and comparing it to things is okay, so what do we need for a character to grow and develop? And I think in a lot of traditional writing craft, techniques, they'll include flaws as an essential part of the character growth journey. And this book seemed to not talk about flaws at all, but just to talk about the sacred fire as something that essentially she develops an ability to claim. And so I want to hear your take on flaws and where they have a place in the heroine's labyrinth.
Okay, man, great observation, by the way. I never thought about it in those exact terms, but the reason I don't think I got hung up on flaws is because we all have them. Flaws are inherently part of your character. She is going to be flawed. In fact, I think one of the problems with some modern day characters is they're trying to remove too many flaws. There's this, I think there's a, and I don't want to be 100% critical because I understand the reasoning behind why they're doing it. I just don't think I don't think it's working. There's a desire to depict, modern heroines or female protagonists as flawless, without flaws. And the thinking behind that is, well, let's have a positive portrayal of women in this story because we don't like historically how some women are portrayed in stories. And there's a total argument there. That is a fair case to make. However, unfortunately, or fortunately, we all have flaws. So you're still going to have to deal with this. The more flaws you take away from the heroine, the less relatable she becomes. It's harder for me to relate to her. I think that was a flaw with Rey in Star Wars is that she
Hmm.
was missing some of those flaws. So vulnerability is a very powerful tool because vulnerability is how almost all of us feel throughout our lives in a lot of situations. So when you make a heroine or a hero, it does not matter the gender. When you make your lead character vulnerable, now you've got us. You've got our attention because it's like, oh, she feels vulnerable. Um, what's she going to do about that? How is she going to handle that? So the flaws that she has, I believe the author will sense intuitively. When I wrote Faraway Bird, her flaw was A, she was attracted to dangerous situations. B, she was very arrogant. And C, she underestimated um bad people in the world and she had such faith in herself that she was blind to real traps in the world and those flaws got her. So when you're writing, just be aware that your character is vulnerable and that vulnerability is going to be expressed in different ways by different people and different characters because there's a wide spectrum of what it means to be human. So you have to look at your character and ask yourself, where are her blind spots if it's a female protagonist? Where are her blind spots? What is it she's not understanding? And you mentioned this was a growth arc. And I think that's correct because if you follow this arc to the end, it's almost impossible to not change. So what is it? So when you're at the beginning of a story, there's also a degree of inexperience on the part of the heroine. There's something she doesn't learn. So even an accomplished heroine, let's say she's a great detective, she's been in the business for 20 years. So now we're looking at a highly competent female protagonist. Well, she's about to come. Well, why tell the story then if she's got this? She's going to have to come up with something. She's going to have to encounter either a villain or a character or a criminal that she doesn't have any context for. This one breaks the mold. This is a new challenge. This is something she's never seen before. So that makes her instantly vulnerable again. So keeping the heroine vulnerable is going to be, I think, a natural case, especially if you can design some of these other archetypes with like the masked minotaur and the native culture. The flaws are going to be inherent. I believe that they're part of the heroine, and I think the author will not struggle to include those flaws as part of the writing. I think they come out organically. I think if you start backwards and say her flaw will be she's clumsy. Well, now you're just going to write her as clumsy, and that's far less interesting than getting an intuitive read on your character as you're writing her and seeing where her blind spots come up as she interacts with other characters, as she interacts with the culture itself. So I think my answer is follow your intuition on where her blind spots are.
Okay, and do you think that the Heroine's Labyrinth also intuitively helps a writer to be able to grow her away or out of those flaws, right?
Yes.
Because having flaws is one thing, and going through a journey of realizing that you were wrong in some areas and maturing out of them is kind of, that's the completion of that arc. And so do you think that the Heroine's Labyrinth has that internal structure built in to kind of grow and mature a heroine out of her flaws?
I do because once you pen in any character, heroine, hero, once you pen them in archetypally, you have conflict. And once you have conflict, the pressure is on the heroine slash author to solve that conflict. I remember even when I was writing Faraway Bird, I was like, man, how is she going to get out of this? I got to come up with a very believable way that she gets out of this. And so you have to do the work yourself. And you're a writer. So, you kick around, you're imagining it, you're kicking around scenarios. So, you have to have your heroine solve these problems. You can't have someone solve them for her. One of the biggest arguments in older depictions of heroines is that they lack agency or that someone else always swoops in to save them. And you know, so we're not going to do that, right? A couple things. One, it's okay to get help. It's okay to have heroic partners come in and help once in a
Yeah.
while, male or female. But also, once you get to something specific, a specific problem in your story, your heroine's going to have to deal with that problem. So I think the way she deals with it becomes the solution. So in my view, the natural way the heroine behaves becomes the solution. I think too many times writers try to come up with the flaw or the solution or things up front and then put it in there, and it always feels like that when you read it. So the Heroine's Labyrinth is designed to, or I shouldn't say designed like I designed this. The Heroine's Labyrinth comes with designs that come with conflict. So by including the designs, you're going to be including conflict, and then it's up to the author to kind of navigate those conflicts themselves when writing the heroine.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. That's good. So the captivity bargain is really interesting to me. The heroine makes a voluntary choice to be in some type of captivity to essentially appease the native culture or perhaps the Minotaur. And so I'm looking at this element structurally, and I know
Yes.
that you said not to do that in the book of just like, okay, stories are going to put these different designs in different places. And so I thought this one was very, very interesting because it seemed like it could be the beginning of a story. It could be something that happens in Act One, like Rapunzel with agreeing to stay in the tower for a little bit,
Yes.
or it could be the premise. She could agree to a captivity bargain, and that could be the labyrinth she steps into. And so I want to hear your thoughts on kind of how this captivity bargain design can be used in different ways.
Right. So the captivity bargain, I believe, is actually very important because this is not, and I want to be clear, this is not something that strips the heroine of her agency. Um, because it is easy to have a reductive role for heroines, at least in the past, right? She's not doing much. She's captive. She's chained to a mountain, and it's up to the hero to come in. The captivity bargain is not evidence of the heroine's weakness, and I think this is vital to understand because she's consciously, and this is why it is often, not always, but often willing. She's willing to make this bargain. Um, and it's not just to appease somebody. It's really her belief that this does lead to social harmony. She's like, okay, maybe this is a good idea. Maybe I should tone it down a bit, which means to scale back her aspirations a little bit in order to create harmony in the world. And quite honestly, I don't care if you're male or female. We all have done this and we all recognize this. And my argument is when you see a heroine in a cage or a male when you see the cage, instantly our minds go to get out of that cage. So a lot of symbols of captivity are like throwing the gauntlet at the character to be like, how is she going to get out of there? Right away. So the captivity bargain, we understand as readers, she's making a bad bargain on some level. And I think the author's job is to make the bargain seem as reasonable as possible. Um, and I had to do that in my story too. I had to really sell. I'd be like, look, this is why we do this. This is why, because if you go this other route, what do you expect? It's going to be chaos, and the heroine's like, well, okay, that makes sense. That's relatable. But you move, this is why you said, yeah, flaws, or you move the hero into the point where she can't accept this bargain anymore. She
Right.
can't do it.
Right.
Barbie has a great snapshot of a captivity bargain. And it's not in Act One. I think it's closer to the end of Act Two. She's in the boardroom with Will Ferrell and all those guys, and you've seen Barbie, right?
Hmm.
Oh, okay. And there's this box there, and they go, get back in the box, and all your problems go away. And Barbie, which I believe is, a strong feminist messaging, story with strong feminist messages, even includes the captivity bargain. She wants to restore social order. Like, she's personally motivated to see social harmony. She gets in the box, and they literally have shackles, which are the twisty ties. Perfect. Perfect for Barbie. That's very creative. And she willingly goes in there, and then at the last second, she changes her mind and she gets out of there. And that whole chase scene is very labyrinthine inside that corporate
Yeah.
office. She's like, there's hallways, there's secret doors and stuff. So the captivity bargain says this is what it becomes the bad example. This is what you get when you just care about social order at the expense of yourself, and that you will come to a point where that's no longer tolerable to you because you must be erased. You must be held down too much in order to have that, to continue to honor this bargain.
So I want to ask a question comparing the heroine's labyrinth with the hero's journey. To my understanding, the hero's journey has these moments called atonement with the father slash abyss. And it seems
Hmm.
like a moment of deep contemplation, facing fears. It's very internal. And it's a moment right before change. And then the next moment is the apotheosis, which is change. So
Right.
that's my understanding. And if that's not right, let me know. But so these seem really fundamental to character growth and to character change and metamorphosis, which is, what the hero's journey is really good at. And so I'm
Yes.
wondering if the Heroine's Labyrinth has those same moments, or if there are designs that could be used as those moments.
Yes, I do. So you're right. The hero's journey is so what I think of the hero's journey is very similar to this as there's archetypal designs, story designs, patterns that when strung together make this narrative arc. And at the end of this arc, there's change, right? Or the hero's destroyed and we lose him and it's a tragic story, but there's still lessons in him coming up short. Just like a heroine, there are scenario like Thelma and Louise where the heroines don't get out of the labyrinth. And yet there's still a message there. There's a warning about stifling the sacred fire of our heroines when we witness the heroine that comes up short. You're still holding up a mirror to society. So um the apotheosis, like you said, is the atonement with Father. This is very male oriented. Um, and you're talking about the pure Campbellian version of this, Joseph Campbell, which is
Right.
the young hero faces his father and sees some sort of commonality there. And without getting too much into the hero's journey, um, the change does come. That's more of an at the end of the story. The hero departs
Hmm.
and returns. Those are the two big elements there. In fact, Joseph Campbell calls Act One the departure and Act Three the return. So with the heroine, Act One is immersion or enculturation, and Act Three is what I call the rearrangement or the permutation, which is the social order, the society, the native culture is rearranged in some way, either really small, like in their eyes we're watching God. She liberates herself in her own house in a way. Or it's huge, like in Hunger Games. She overturns the entire social order in like revolution. So that's the rearrangement. And you'll see this a lot in those stories. Now, as far as the personal character growth for the heroine, I do have something that I call atonement in this. And this is
Right.
where, so there's a lot of pressure on the heroine. The heroine might feel a lot of guilt in breaking the captivity bargain. That is a common side effect of saying, screw this, I'm going to go my own way. There's guilt there. You're saying, I'm going to do something for me this time, and you might not feel good about that, especially with all the pressure that the native culture puts on you, either through the cultural messaging themselves or from the family. So at the end of the story, the heroine has achieved something, and she has to go through an atonement process too. Um, so let me take one step back. The thing with heroines is she was often right about something that was denied to her. People she trusted or people she believed told her she was wrong about something. This is often the central dynamic here. And she bet the farm that she was right. And she was right in a lot of these stories. So she has to reconcile that result. I went with my hunch against all the odds, and I was right. How does she feel about herself right there? What does she think? Her identity has to change too. She's not the maiden phase. She's not the inexperienced heroine we met in the beginning. She was right about something. She has to face that in herself. How does she feel about that? You know, can she handle the fact that she did all this and got it right? Um, Two, the native culture has to reconcile with her and her with the native culture. In most cases, the heroine does not hate the native culture. She just couldn't accept the bargain they gave her. And so she fought the native culture on some level because of this bargain. So at the end of the story, there should be a moment where the heroine and the native culture see eye to eye. The native culture is like, we recognize what you've done and we have changed our attitude about you. And the heroine says, and you know what? You're not all bad. I accept. I understand where you're coming from a little bit more. This is a huge process. That in and of itself reminds me of like a therapy session where you come to terms with something. That's where growth happens, when you can come to terms with something that has been an ongoing conflict. Moana has a great example of this. I absolutely love Moana. So the conch shell becomes one symbol for Moana. It's actually used like breadcrumbs, which is a labyrinth element. They lead her into the ocean early on in the story, and her father takes her up to the top. And the native culture has a claim on her, right? There's a whole song dedicated to it. This is what we do on this island, and no one leaves. And this is what we do on this island, and you're going to be the princess. So that's the native culture staking out its claim on the heroine. The heroine is like, okay, but my dream is to go out beyond the breakers. I want to explore. That's her sacred fire. She has this incredible drive to go out and explore regardless of the danger. And the native culture says, no, you're going to be the princess on this island where we're going to stay forever. The end, and he takes her up, and there's this I think it's called the Place of Chiefs, at the top of this mountain, and the ruler is supposed to set another stone on top of the mountain as their symbol. That's beautiful symbolism for continuity, right? A cairn, you're stacking it, you are adding to this. And at the end of the movie, this movie reconciles the two very, very well. Her sacred fire was to explore, and the native culture is never to leave. She discovers that what she does is she restores a lost value to the native culture, which was to be explorers. So at the end of the movie, she accepts her role as princess, and she puts something on top of the Place of Chiefs, which is the conch shell instead of a stone, her symbol. But so she will be the princess, but it will be as a seafaring nation, which honors her sacred fire too. So it's a perfect reconciliation. And there's growth there, not only by her, but also by the native culture. They see things differently because of her actions.
Yeah, I absolutely love that example. And I'm really glad you took the time to go through it in the book and here, because I think that that's just an incredible example of that essentially compromise
Right.
between her not abandoning what she believes in, the
Right.
sacred fire, but also recognizing that she is part of the culture. And not only that, but that the culture is valuable to her. Right? She doesn't
Yes.
want to just go off and seafare forever. Like there's something valuable about her culture that she wants to be a part of, but she doesn't want to completely compromise who she is to do it.
Absolutely right. I was just going to add the one phrase. The native culture has, and a lot of heroines struggle with this in so many stories. It's amazing. And I've even heard, like in real life, like when I'll talk to my mom or my wife, and it seems to be, pretty common even in real life. The native culture is part of her identity. So when you say there's something valuable to her, there is an element of identity to the native culture that's very hard for the heroine to shake. And so she kind of needs that. But but not at the expense of her individuation. And I think that's the reconciliation process that has to take place in these stories, and good stories give us that. Did you have another thought there?
I did have a thought, yeah. So the Disney movies seem to capture the idea of kind of almost like an equal handshake of like I will keep what's important to me, but I will, be part of this culture. And the culture is like, okay, we're going to give up, like trying to force you to conform.
Right,
And it seems like classic literature is a little bit heavier on the side of culture winning a little bit more,
right,
but the heroine still holding on to what makes her special, or the sacred fire. She doesn't give it up, and yet she can't really change culture all that much. And I think that probably a reason for that is that it's based on a real historical time period where society was kind of like gridlocked. Like if you went outside those bounds, you were going to be just kind of cast out. So my thought here is like, it's interesting to see this done in different ways. And I think in the book you said that this can be done, to larger and smaller extents, where sometimes when the spell breaks over the native culture, it might just be for one person, or it may
right.
be for a small group of people. It may not be that culture changes because of the heroine.
Right.
And so I think those classic stories give an interesting perspective that's a little bit different than the Disney stories do.
100%. That's a great observation too, because I think what happened in folk tales, the native culture, the story actually takes the side of the native culture in the older stories. In fact, if you actually look at Wizard of Oz, her final conclusion is there's no place like home. That says, I was wrong to want to adventure. I should have just stayed home. And sometimes I'm like, man, that's kind of the native culture wins, and so it's interesting. There's a lot of the older stories that take the side of the native culture. Their message is, while you, dear heroine, want all these things, it's best to just kind of do what we had planned for you. And then I think you have the 18th century literature, which recognizes the power of culture over the individual, especially with heroines. And they basically are saying, here's this, like you said, gridlocked, monolithic, powerful culture. We are going to show you that the heroine has plans that are at odds with this, and we're going to hold that mirror up. Like I think of the Scarlet Letter. We're going to hold that mirror up, I think it makes people, they put the book down and they're like, do we really want our culture to be like this? Do we really want this? Is that fair to women? Is that fair to her? Should we keep doing this? Should we revisit some of these rules? Should we reconsider a cultural value that might be obsolete? So these books, that's what a lot of those books did. Jane Eyre, she loses in that. She doesn't get what she wants. Mr. Rochester, there was a real connection there, and that was sacrificed against the altar of culture, but these are still holding up a mirror. And then modern stories, a lot of times, show the hero, take the side of the hero in Sacred Fire in this conflict, and show us the power and the value of the individual contributions of the heroine that the native culture either did not recognize or was not asking for, or didn't have a system to allow to come to fruition. So I think it is good to have a reconciliation. And I think you said it best. The key is not at the expense of the heroine's sacred fire or her own individual beliefs, and also not at the expense of the culture. If the heroine turns against the entire culture in totality, she actually becomes a villain. But that's not what good stories tell it. They show us usually how she found her way and improved the native culture, and how the native culture recognizes that. Clarice Starling at the end, she gets her badge. She was right. She did it. She solved that.
What I've been thinking about is like the ending of the relationship between the native culture and the heroine is that she finds her place in the native culture, and she has to carve out a place for herself because there isn't a natural place for her.
You're right, but she's not just carving it out randomly, right? The segment she's carving out is tied directly to her sacred fire. She knows what she
Right.
wants, and then she runs into these walls. So her carving it out is, how can I live up to this aspiration in this context, in this setting, in this world, in this time and place? And that's what she's carving out. And so that's the part of it. So it's not like she just she has to build out this something at random. It is directly tied. Her solutions are directly tied to her sacred fire, her aspirations.
Right, and to her problems, her conflict, which is because of this claim on her sacred fire. And so it's all directly having
Correct.
to do with this element that everybody wants. And so, yeah, finding that
Yes,
ability
absolutely.
for everyone to live with it at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, Clarice Starling's sacred fire is her desire to save victims. And, it's interesting because Hannibal Lecter wants her sacred fire too. When he gives her the quid pro quo, he's like, I'll help you solve this case. And what does he ask for in return? He just wants intimate details of her private life, but he not like weird, kinky stuff. He zeroes in on the moment her sacred fire was first showed itself, her attempt to save that one lamb. He zeroes in on that. That's him getting as close as he can to that sacred fire. Whereas Buffalo Bill tries to take something similar, the feminine essence essentially, and take that out by force. To take that by force and to literally put it on himself in that sense.
So you said something a little while back that I wanted to kind of pivot to. So
Okay.
you were talking about when the heroine turns against her native culture, she becomes the villain. So I want to talk about dystopian stories. I don't think that a dystopian story necessarily has to be a labyrinth archetype because the it's telling you something different than just what society is she in. It's telling you the journey that she's going through emotionally. And so
Correct.
dystopian doesn't necessarily mean labyrinth archetype. Is that correct?
It I don't think it necessarily means that, but it might. Because if you're talking about a dystopia, you're usually talking about a malfunctioning culture. And so a labyrinth model might prove very well. However, like in Star Wars, you can make the case that it's a dystopian militant society, and somebody from far away comes out to tackle this. I do also want to just add a caveat to what you said. The heroine turning against her native culture doesn't, or maybe I'm putting a caveat on what I said for clarity. It's not if the heroine turns against her native culture, it makes her a villain. What it means is if she turns against her native culture to the degree that she begins to oppress it herself, that's when she becomes a villain. If she turns against her native culture and there's all these other willing people that are like, we agree with you, you're our leader, that's a revolution. That's
Yeah.
different. So I
Yep.
just wanted to make that little clarification because I don't want to make it because you need the revolutionaries and you need them. They're the ones who are willing to go up against the big dystopian society in order to overturn the social order when that becomes necessary. So and it doesn't make her a villain.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't say so, and I don't think really anyone else would.
Okay,
But
okay.
but it's just interesting because it's like, oh, okay, that is what that story's about.
Well, like
Um,
Maleficent, I think is
exactly.
more of an example of where she actually becomes oppressive herself. Moana, um, Teika.
Mhm.
Believe it or not, you can take a Heroine's Labyrinth analysis of her, the
Right.
goddess, as a character. Her sacred fire was stolen from her, and I've noticed that some of the most aggressive behavior, one of the worst things you could do to a heroine is steal her sacred fire. And you saw what happened. Her sacred fire was stolen, and she punishes the society to the point where she's oppressive. But another beautiful reconciliation. Her sacred fire is restored, and the spell is broken, and she lifts this sort of oppression from the culture itself.
Right. So to sum that up a little bit, dystopian stories lend themselves to labyrinth archetypes because of the natural structure of a dystopian society and the cultural conflict.
I believe so because we're talking when you say dystopia, that's kind of a made up word that we've come up with to describe society gone bad. But it just keeps operating and it still has power and it just oppresses people. So when you say dystopia, you're almost saying labyrinth in my mind. You're setting the stage for something that needs to be confronted. Um, but I never say always. I hate saying it's always going to be this
Yeah.
way. I think you can find a hero's journey in a dystopia. Um, I do have something where I call insurgent good versus insurgent evil. Star Wars is insurgent good, where you have this dystopia, and there's this small group of insurgents that are the good guys that try to topple it. And then there's something like insurgent evil, where you have like Lord of the Rings. Society seems to be fine; they're the good, but evil is creeping back in, and they're going to try to knock it out. And both of those I think of are hero's journey stories.
Right. So I want to talk about like when a story follows a labyrinth arc but deviates a little bit, and
Yes.
when a story is not a labyrinth but has some labyrinth elements. So what this is really all getting at is that I'm looking at some stories and I'm like, it's really hard to exactly figure out what the absolute baseline criteria is for a labyrinth because a
Sure.
lot of elements are kind of give or take. But what
Yes.
elements are absolutely fundamental where if you do not have these, it is not a labyrinth?
Well, I would say it would have to, for it to be a labyrinth, you would have to have sociocultural conflicts or an actual labyrinth. Like Wendy Torrance in The Shining, they put an actual labyrinth in there, which mirrors her problems inside the Overlook Hotel, which is also a labyrinth with a minotaur in the center. So, in fact, I put down some criteria for what I thought it was, but to be fair, I'm always, as a writer, I'm very sensitive to people who come in and give me absolutes, right? I just don't trust someone saying this is the way it is, that there's no flexibility in these things.
It's
Um,
not how writing works. It's not how storytelling
Thank
works.
you.
Yeah.
It's not how writing works. And the more you box in a creative person, the more they're going to be like, I'll prove you wrong.
Let me subvert that. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So I do think the sociocultural conflict is one of them. So a dystopia, I think, lends itself very well to a labyrinthine story. Um, Remember, the labyrinth is I think it exists as a system of choices with cultural consequences, the win-lose scenario, and then also what you can and can't do. So, and I've noticed this, and this is always interesting. When you start in a story, especially early on, when you start telling a heroine, don't ever go through that door. Like you are captivating the reader because our brains are programmed to take in the rules. Like it's weird. I found out while writing that people were very like addicted to the writing when you start having a character tell your character what to do. When they start laying out the rule, that's why sci-fi can be so fun because you're like, oh, we always choose two from every district. Like, oh, okay. Like we start to reprogram our minds to that culture in the story. So I think when you really focus on that, you're probably in a labyrinth. However, I do want to say there are a lot of examples of stories where there are both simultaneous heroes' journeys and heroines' labyrinths. In fact, I have found numerous examples of this at this point. One easy one that I found for that I think most people have seen the movie. Have you seen Wreck-It Ralph?
Yes.
Okay, I love Wreck-It Ralph, by the way.
Yeah, it's great.
Wreck-It Ralph is beautiful because Ralph goes on a hero's journey. He departs his native culture, right? He
Yep.
confronts militant evil, the militant outsiders, the cybugs. He gets himself the medal, and then he returns to the native culture. Vanellope does not leave her native culture. Her problems are right there. There's a villain in disguise, Turbo, as he's disguised as King Candy. And her problems are right there culturally. They do not let her race. There's rules to this. We can't let you do this because you glitch and blah, blah, blah. So she has a heroine's labyrinth in Sugar Rush, while Ralph has a hero's journey when he leaves Fix It Felix, his video game. So that's an example of simultaneous characters undergoing both types of journeys. Barbie, believe it or not, starts as a hero's journey. She
Right.
departs the native culture, but she returns in the middle of the movie, and then it settles into a heroine's labyrinth where the home is compromised. Ken literally takes over her dream house. So, that's a movie that's a little bit of a hybrid as well. Aliens is a hybrid. She fights the militant evil outsider, the Queen Alien, but she also has to unmask the villain from her native culture, Burke. So she pulls double duty in both movies, actually, in that regard. So these archetypes, there's no absolute shape to this. That's why I prefer to call these archetypal designs because I
Yeah.
think they can appear or not depending on the story. I felt like my job was to present it in a way that made the most sense, and then to give it a name. But I think your instincts are correct that it's not a fixed, rigid system.
Okay, so I want to ask you about two examples and get your take on what type of story this is. So,
Okay,
so Mulan and Eowyn from The Lord of the Rings. So to me, what these stories look like are they're warrior maidens going
right.
out on a journey to defeat a known unknown evil that is kind of the distant dragon figure of the hero's journey.
Correct.
And they are the ones who face off against those distant dragons in one-to-one combat.
Yep.
And yet they are oppressed by the native culture because they have to disguise themselves
Yes.
as men. And both of them, I think, feature kind of the fragile power character of with Mary and with the dragon Mushu.
Yes,
Uh,
totally.
so what? Yeah, what's your take on what those fit into?
I think you just nailed it. I think that so the hero's journey does seem to have a kind of warrior or a hunter warrior ethos. And I include both hunter and warrior because a hunter, like if you think of it from the hunter gatherer standpoint, would leave the village to go, take down the woolly mammoth or whatever and bring it home, right? So it's a similar pattern. So I do think there is a warrior ethos to the hero's journey. So, and you just brought up two great examples. By the way, Kill Bill is another where there is a clear-cut warrior ethos to the female lead, and she undergoes several of the hero's journey steps. However, and I think, by the way, that these work sometimes in tandem to make a very compelling story. You still have the elements, the heroine's conflict triangle that you would find in the Labyrinth. So I do think that they are just straight up hybrids. They both
Okay.
also have a fragile power. A lot of male characters tend to lack this fragile power. And it doesn't, you said Mary. I love that one. Eowyn. So the story's not about Eowyn, right? It's about
Right, right.
Frodo and all the. But here we have one of the
She's
few
there.
legitimate heroines of the story, and it's all there. You cannot do this. You cannot go out on the you can't go out on the battlefield. And the king in the movie, the king says, Mary's like, I want to go fight. And the guys make fun of him. They're like, oh, your arm's not long enough. And they're teasing him. She's ticked at this. She doesn't like that. She's like, how come he can't go fight for who he loves? She's defending Mary because she has been overlooked as well. So she takes issue
Right.
with this idea that she and Mary, neither of them fit the model of the warrior. So that's part of what bonds her to Mary. She's like, that's not fair. And she's right about something. Again, like she's betting on this. And the king says, I can't bear to have Mary on the battlefield. It's way too dangerous. And it is. The king's not wrong. Eowyn brings him out anyway. She brings this fragile power out onto the battlefield. And then when the king is knocked down, it's a beautiful moment. And there's this is one of my favorite archetypal designs, the Shield Maiden. The Shield Maiden
Yeah.
archetype is when the heroine physically interposes herself between a monstrous power, usually the masked Minotaur, and a defenseless person that shares the battlefield with her. The second defense, and just usually just a couple feet away. The second character is often missing in hero's journey stories. Like when Luke fights Vader, it's mano a mano, baby. Like it's they're going
Right.
at it. Mary is right there. So anyway, she brings the fragile power out. The Nazgul comes in, knocks down the king. Really, it's a mortal blow. The king is lying there. He's in danger, and Eowyn leaps in front of him, and she's like, "You will not touch him." I mean, this was the person that's not supposed to be on the battlefield. She takes this guy down, and how does she do it? She's overmatched, by the way, and which is often the case with the Shield Maiden. She's overmatched, physically at least. And Mary, the fragile power, the one that she bet the farm on this guy. He comes up, stabs it in the leg. By the way, in the book, and they suggested in the movie, in the book, he loses control of his arm. Um,
Hmm.
Distracts him, and she's able to kill the Witch King of Angmar right then and there. And so her betting on the fragile power becomes critical in the climax. So you have a beautiful heroine's labyrinth, even inside a classic hero's journey story. All you have to do is focus on Eowyn. When you place Eowyn at the center of the story in your mind, you're like, okay, what's going on with her? You'll see the elements of the heroine's labyrinth at work. And by the way, this is an exciting thing to actually point out. A New Hope, which is always used as a classic hero's journey, always every book for 40 years. If the second you shift to Princess Leia, you have a
Right.
heroine's labyrinth. You start an act. There's about a third of the heroine's labyrinth, almost in order that Princess Leia follows, and I think that's actually part of the secret sauce of A New Hope. Is Princess Leia? If you think about Darth Vader, one of the greatest villains of all time, in the movie A New Hope, he has almost nothing to do with Luke Skywalker. Nothing at all. He bumps into Luke at the end in the trench and he's about to shoot him, and then Han knocks him off course. That's the extent of Luke and Vader. That incidental contact at the end of the movie. Vader is Leia's villain through that almost the entire movie, with a little bit of Obi-Wan Kenobi there, obviously, as well. But she entrusts the fragile power with R2D2, the Death Star plans. She bets the farm. She gives the Death Star plans over to R2, and R2's like, "You got it." You know, these fragile powers take this very seriously and live up to great feats because the faith that the heroine placed in them.
It's great when you see a story that is really following the archetype and you recognize it and you're like, that works and that's amazing. But I think it's so cool when you see the two archetypes crossing in the same story or when you see these deviations, these hybrids. I think the hybrids are really cool.
I do too.
We only have a few minutes here. So I wanted to bring this up. This is a little bit of a contentious one. But
Oh,
is there an argument for the Hunger Games being a hybrid story? And here's my thoughts on this. So you say in the book that District 12 is her native culture, and to me that makes a lot of sense because when she goes to the capital, it feels like she is going to a foreign culture of just like it everything is backwards, almost to a magical degree,
correct.
technologically and culturally, and she also has very masculine character traits. Her like motivation is to come back home and protect her family. And so it almost feels like a leaving home, going to a foreign land to the boon that she would be trying to accomplish would essentially be the ability to protect her family, the ability to come home and put food on the table. And I think there are a couple other ones like that. But then there are things like her friendship with Rue being, again, the fragile power.
Fragile
People
power.
overlook her. Right. So do you think there's an argument for that being a hybrid, or are you convinced it is totally a Labyrinth story? I'm
Nope.
open.
There's a total argument for what you just said. In fact, I don't think it's just an argument. I think it's a great argument that it's a little bit of a hybrid because you're right. When she goes to the Capitol, even the music, they have this like alien sounding music and or it's like a oboe or something. Um, they're clearly trying to establish that she is a fish out of water when she reaches the capital. So you do have this element of being kind of thrust away from your comfort zone into a departure situation where you're now encountering exotic elements. So and even so, when the hero departs, there's usually a threshold, which Hunger Games also has, and like you said, there is a warrior ethos. I'll only point out that although she has a warrior ethos, her original use of the bow and arrow is for hunting. So it's a very practical reason, but it is hunter warrior ethos. So she still fits that model.
Right.
So I think there's an absolute case, and believe it or not, I don't think it's contentious at all. I think these archetypes, if you can spot an archetype and you're like, well, that's a departure. Well, you just spotted it. So if it's there, I think
Right.
our job is to ask ourselves, like, huh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that. Why does this work? Why does it work? Because it works, right? I think Hunger Games is a successful, excellent story. So our job is to just ask why it works. Um, I also think Hunger Games has one of the greatest sacred fire moments ever. Literally, she's like riding into the Capitol and catches on fire. It's like
Yeah.
a cornerstone moment in
Great.
the story and in the book. And you don't get much more dramatic than that. You're right. Rue is there. That is a fragile power scenario. I actually think of what she does as a shield maiden moment in the beginning when her sister is chosen, and she's like, no,
Yes.
no, choose me. She doesn't think
Yeah.
about it. She's not calculating. She's just doing it. Very characteristic of a shield maiden, protecting her sister at that point. So there's absolutely elements of both. And I think people should be totally comfortable with that.
Yeah. I like that answer. I like it a lot because I was like, I see both and I don't know what to do with this. And I tend to probably see in black and white a little bit more with story structure. And so when I see all the stuff in the beginning of the book about like don't think in structure, don't think in rigid, equations. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'll have to get used to this. But so I like that. I like that there's that flexibility because if I'm not able to put it in one camp or the other, I'm like, well, what do I do with it? And so, if it's allowed to be hybrid, great. That's what it is.
Absolutely allowed to be hybrid, and it depends on where your story takes you. So if your story, what this is meant to do is it's meant for you to look at and then ask yourself, will this work in my story? And then you'll see it'll auto-populate. You're like, oh yeah, that'll work. I'll put a fragile power in there, and oh my God, that changes everything. That's what I want. So suddenly things will take off in your story. This will trigger good ideas because these archetypes work.
Yeah.
But you don't have to follow a rigid model. I was free of the hero's journey, but my story still has hero's journey elements in it. Like the wise mentor. I was very insistent on having that. So anyway, I know we're pressed for time, but you're definitely flexible to go either way.
Okay, great. Well, awesome. Thanks so much for talking with me about this. I feel like we got through almost all my questions. So all
Oh,
the
awesome.
things, yeah, all the things that I was like, oh, but what about this? What about this? I'm just, it's just awesome that I get to talk to you about it. So thanks.
Very cool. Yeah, I enjoyed it, and clearly you have a lot of your own framework you're operating from, and so that makes for compelling conversation already because you're gonna have your own take on these things. So I appreciate that too.
Yeah, of course. It was a great conversation. Once again, you can find Douglas's book, The Heroine's Labyrinth, which we discussed in this video, and also his historical fiction novel, Faraway Bird, on Amazon. And don't forget to leave reviews if you read his books. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope it was instructive. It was really helpful for clarifying my thoughts on this topic, and it was also just great to talk with Douglas. Give the video a like and subscribe for more writing craft content, and I will see you in another video. Bye.